Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for a slight delay, but it was a busy day for everyone. I hope you enjoyed the lunch break. We will have a fairly crisp and short discussion today about a topic that we have, together with Professor Ruschel, introduced here to this conference, which is a broader discussion about the role of NATO in energy security. So for the last 3 years, we have been organizing on a regular basis 1 or 2 panels centered around the role of NATO. And this year we have decided to make it as comprehensive as possible, we had in fact 3 speakers coming from different parts of the transatlantic family, if I may say so. Dr. Mikulska from Baker Institute, US, Mr. Julian Wieczorkiewicz from International Staff NATO, Emerging Security Challenges Division, the Climate and Energy section, and Mr. Philippe van Exem, who currently serves as a civilian co-chair of the Petroleum Committee in NATO, and he works at the Defense Policy and Planning Division in NATO International Staff. So today, basically the idea of this panel is to give you an overview of what has been the core, the center of the discussion in NATO, but in also broader context of the transatlantic relations when it comes to energy security, including energy transition. So I think we'll start with you, Anna, to zoom it out a little bit, and then we'll zoom it in with my 2 NATO colleagues. If you could start to basically portray where we are in terms of the risk and challenges in transatlantic relations when it comes to energy security and energy transition, including, of course, the role of Russia, the role of China, and the role of other actors. And then we'll move to the answer that NATO is providing in the current security environment. Anna, over to you.
Thank you.
I think you need to switch it on here. Here. I'll switch it over to you. I'll do mine.
Okay.
You go, Anna.
Sorry about that. Apparently, I'm the troublemaker today. Thank you very much.
You're never a troublemaker, just to make sure.
Great. Yeah, I think it's the idea of energy security has become more important after the invasion on Ukraine, particularly more important in the developed world. It almost has been forgotten, in the developed countries where a lot of energy and ability to get energy whenever we want, in whatever volumes you want, was taken for granted. And then, once all of a sudden, it turned out that maybe that could not be the case, and at some point, maybe we would have to ration energy. And I think, some of the Polish people here probably remember rationing energy is no fun. I remember when my parents couldn't put gas in the car because it was rationed, right? So that kind of has become more important for all of us. The developing world has known and has focused on energy security all along. It's just now it seems that the developed world came back to the realization that that's something that's not given, and that's something that we need to ensure in order for our countries and our societies to develop in a way that we want them to now. And I was quite actually positive and quite optimistic about that there is this field of understanding that could push for more understanding between developed and developing countries in a way to develop more diverse ways of approaching new energy sources, and that incorporate the idea of energy security and all of the above often of strategy. I think this is probably up for discussion whether this happened or not, but there is still a division, I believe, in the developed and developing countries in terms of looking at energy security, and I think it depends on who can afford what, and that's going to be a problematic issue when we speak to about NATO and non-NATO countries. And we know that Europe can afford very expensive LNG, but Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam couldn't, for example. So that's something that NATO will also have to look and thinking about energy security. and kind of how we approach other countries and what it means for our security, but also for security of other countries, as well as for energy transition. I think the one big, one of the biggest threats that happened is also the issue of China. And I've looked at China from the perspective of natural gas and LNG imports. And energy, and I look at energy security issues with LNG imports. What we see now, China growing to the position of actually quite important actor in buying a lot of contracted natural gas that for now China is willing to sell, especially when it makes money. But it's not given. Again, this is not a commercial actor. Those companies are not commercial actors that at any given time will have to submit their will to the will of the policymakers, and that is often not necessarily predictable. So it's something that we need to look at, how we approach trade with different countries and how we secure ourselves from being dependent, as we should have learned from the dependency of the European NATO allies on Russia. Russia itself, also in relation to China, is an interesting actor, because it seems that maybe we don't know yet what Russia's role is going to be, but there is a possibility of Russia literally becoming a vassal state to China, as it depends on it for revenues from different type of energy resources. The last word on China is that the energy security policy they pursue is all of the above. There's a lot of talk about renewable energy. There's a lot of talk about China producing a lot of renewable infrastructure. But at the same time, China is building its energy security via new mining of coal mining, bringing in LNG, but also its own natural gas resources, and building nuclear power and so on. So they have quite a different approach than a lot of the developed nations, including the NATO allies. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I think one of the elements that is crucial from a NATO perspective, and I'll give the floor to Julian right away, is that we have learned that dependency is something that we wouldn't like to replicate in the future. So basically, the dependency that allies have faced when it comes to Russia could very soon translate into a potential dependency on China. Is that something of concern to NATO, and how NATO, basically bearing in mind what has happened since February 2022, has reacted to it? What are the key decisions that NATO has taken when it comes to energy and security? Julian, it would be great if you could walk us through. And the one tiny element is your PowerPoint presentation is still in the limbo. The NATO HQ email has not been fully operational, so you'll have to do without the PowerPoint.
This is fine. Thank you. My name is Julian. I work at NATO, dealing with energy security. Thank you. And to answer your question, let me first rebound on what Anna has said. It is true that energy security is really, an issue that is very closely looked at NATO currently. A couple of years back, it was absolutely not the case. It was a secondary issue with not so much attention. Now it really has a lot of traction. There's a lot of processes and debates ongoing, decisions being made, and I'll try to walk you through them. Well, first of all, let me start with the mandate that NATO has. NATO is not the EU, NATO is not a EU member state. We don't do legislation, we don't do energy policies, we have no, we cannot legislate in essence. But what we can do and what we're doing, first of all, we discuss energy development, especially their links to hardcore security, be it through briefings at the HQ, be it through intel work that is being done by colleagues working in the intelligence branch, but also by providing allies with analytical reports for them to implement to build up their resilience, the resilience of their power system, energy systems, of their societies. For instance, we look currently very closely at what Russia has done to Ukraine last winter, and we are drawing recommendations for allies. What lessons should they implement to make themselves more secure? But what we also do, we have a mandate to protect critical energy infrastructure since many years. Now, obviously, after the Nord Stream sabotage, it's at the very center of that strength of work. But I'll come back to that, but we also train allies and partners when it comes to critical energy infrastructure protection. For instance, in October, we will be training around 30 Ukrainians in that field ahead of this winter. And finally, NATO also is responsible for ensuring reliable energy supplies to the military. I believe that Philippe will touch upon it. So after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO beefed up its presence on the eastern flank, and our job is to make sure that the forces deployed in that part of Europe will be adequately sustained in energy supplies in all scenarios, not only in peacetime. Second, last year at the summit, NATO adopted its new strategic concept. The strategic concept is a Bible to NATO. It kind of charters the way for the years to come in terms of what NATO is doing and what we will do. And for the first time ever, Dominik touched upon it in his intro, NATO allies recognized that indeed Russia and China, without naming them so, are manipulating energy supplies, are not acting as commercial actors, and cautioned against the manipulation of energy supplies. Also, what is very noteworthy, prior to this year's summit in June, NATO decided to establish a cell that was anchored at NATO's Maritime Command, a cell that is dealing with the protection of critical underwater infrastructure. So not only gas pipelines, power cables, but also all kinds of other infrastructure, for instance, telecom cables. And this is being beefed up. NATO also massively expanded its ties with the industry, so with all major stakeholders operating underwater infrastructure under the Baltic, Atlantic, Black, and Mediterranean seas. So we liaise with them very directly to make sure that those installations are adequately protected. And perhaps let me end with another topic that will keep us busy for the years to come. There is a process that is starting at NATO currently, essentially looking at how the ongoing energy transition to low-carbon energy sources will affect or might affect the military, and what should be done about it. Because currently what we're seeing is, if you look at data from Germany in August, so last month, only 37% of cars that were registered on the market are actually fuel or diesel cars. If you look at China, 37% of cars that were produced in China last month were electric. So there is a global energy transition ongoing. You might like it, you might not like it, but you cannot deny it. And at some point in time, not today, not tomorrow, not in 2-5 years, but in 10, 15, 20, it will massively impact what the military is doing, how they're operating. And the danger in that, and this is the reason why this initiative called the Energy Transition by Design Initiative was launched and advertised by the Secretary General, is to try to use NATO as a platform to establish new standards, to make sure that to make sure that the military equipment of the future will be able to talk to each other. To cut the long story short, if you will bring, I don't know, a electric infantry fighting vehicle from the Netherlands to Poland in 20 years, you'll have to make sure that you'll be able to plug it in somewhere, for instance. So the rationale behind that is not driven by climate considerations, although as well, it's mainly driven by interoperability, to make sure that our equipment will be able to communicate and operate with each other. Because currently life is easy. You pull in some fuel, you put it in your tank, in your helicopter, you fly, you drive, no problem. But what will happen if, for instance, the Dutch, which are already doing it, will invest in electric fighting vehicles, and the Germans will go, hypothetically, for hybrid or other means. I mean, so we need to make sure that everything is coordinated. I'll stop here, and I think that Philippe, you can follow up.
Yeah, just to add to what Julian said, I think you have heard how many things NATO has been doing since last year when it comes to energy security. And I think, you know, in all frankness, of course, it basically also means that energy security discussions for the next few years will be centered around two major topics. One is probably Ukraine and the lessons from the war for the alliance, and the second one is energy transition, which, as Julian said, for the moment is a broader concept that needs to be fully kind of also understood by NATO structures, by military, in a way that it could be implemented in the next decade or so. But I think this, you're absolutely right, this is one of the top priorities for the Secretary General, and then of course for NATO itself. But I also said it's easy. We are just coming with our tanks, loading fuel to them, and there you go. NATO is fully operational, interoperable, and Philippe is, of course, responsible for that. Just for your awareness, last year we've organized a panel discussion around the NATO pipeline system, a topic which I would also like to touch upon today. But how, Philippe, if you could walk us through how NATO has also been adapting itself internally to what we are currently seeing more broadly in the energy domain, and how this adaptation, the as we call it, you call it PC adaptation, which is Petroleum Committee adaptation, and the things which Petroleum Committee deals with, and how does this translates into the future NATO operations and ability to act, including, of course, ability to defend and deter and defend potential adversaries. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, thank you very much. Is it on?
No?
No.
Should we? Yeah, it's on. It's on.
No, it's not. Just, you mentioned the Petroleum Committee. Just up front, I would say the Petroleum Committee is actually the senior advisory body, the senior consultant for our political masters in NATO when it comes to NATO petroleum. Okay, so it's there for since '55. So it's one of the oldest committees. The name used to be Pipeline Committee. Now it's Petroleum Committee. Actually, what we do, what the committee that I have the honor to chair is going to do is actually materialize what Julian has pointed out. You know, what does this energy transition means for operations? Okay, so we are discussing alternative energies for over 20 years, but they were all liquid fuel centric. So we talked about biofuels, synthetic fuels, and mineral fuels as such. So that we've talked about that. We have had programs, science and technology programs, all you can think of. We are good. But now, today, we see the energy transition materializing, as just pointed out by Julian. So where are we in NATO? From an operational perspective, at strategic level, we need to do something. That we found out. So Allies decided to have a conference on operational energy. That's what we name it. You know, the new energy mix, the new global energy mix. We call that operational energy. So we organized to do so. We understood very quickly that we had to reach out to policymakers, industry, academics, and also the operational community to find out, to gather enough data, to gather enough insights to make informed decisions on the way ahead. Okay, so we did that, and we actually organized a conference around 3 themes. It was the adapting to the energy transition, the energy and energy technologies, emerging technologies. We addressed that too. And then NATO's transition to operational energy. So what is the angle from an operational view? So we got like a policy angle there, a technology angle, and an operational angle. So the answer out of our strategic and policy discussion was that NATO needs to align itself with international energy strategy and policies. It speaks for itself. It's the private sector that is driving the ship, you know, or driving the car, not NATO as such. So we have to be able to link to there. We understood that industry will drive the efforts to ensure for us a resilient energy supply and also the transition to renewable energy as such. So it's for us, it's for all of us in our day-to-day life, but also for NATO. So that's the second thing that we came out. So, and then on the technology side, we had quite a number of companies coming and institutions that are do day-to-day business from the technological side. So there's a lot of new technologies coming up to us. One thing became very clear to us, that sustainable liquid fuels are here to stay for maybe 30, 40 years. So there will be a shift from the mineral oils to the synthetic components. When we come, just for your information, when I speak sustainable fuels, these are synthetic fuels from a feedstock that is sustainable, like for example waste. Okay, when it comes to synthetic fuel from gas, then it's not sustainable. Then it's a synthetic fuel. Just to make things clear, because there's a lot to do nowadays about sustainable aviation fuel. So we need to understand the difference between synthetic fuel and sustainable fuel. So out of the debates, we will face new technologies, which will impact capability development, and therefore we will have to be prepared. From an operational aspect, the main thing is that nations, allies, that already went through the process of the energy transition on a national basis, they come up and said, okay, one factor is thing, we should not, it should not harm the operational effectiveness of NATO operations. So if we will go to the new energy mix, there cannot be a negative impact, it was raised by Julian, on conducting NATO operations. So we do not want to become the Green Party. That's what the operationals, those that have to do the things on the battlefield. Of course, in the political corridors and so forth, you know, they like to wave the green flag, and we are doing all sorts of things for climate. You know, it's good for corporate image, but not necessarily for operations. So, having had these insights, we actually identified 4 areas which we need to work on and we need to consider adapting. The first is energy resilience. Resilience is the key, and I will come back to that when we want to talk probably about the NATO fuel supply chain in a moment. So it's the basis for sustainable military operations, you know, and that underpins also a credible NATO's deterrence and defense. So it's linked together. So the energy transition towards renewable sources will require a joint effort of governments, industry, and other relevant stakeholders to ensure continuity of essential services. The second thing is interoperability. So if you say, tell me in one word, what is this all about you're doing at your NATO Petroleum Committee, then I would say it's about interoperability. Interoperability is key. It's not new. Interoperability through standardization is one means, but you also need training and so forth, practicing to test your interoperability. So there, obviously, the new energy mix will will impact the infrastructures, the supply chains in general, and also the capabilities. So we will have to rethink our structure and our tasks to ensure that we get that right too. Capacity, well, it's about capability development. Capacity is one, but capability is maybe better. So the shift towards renewable energy will affect allies' armaments programs and call for new technologies and investment. So there we need to think about a mindset shift from cost to value. So if we want to be performant, if we want to accommodate the new energy mix, it will cost money, but we need to look at what is the effect of our investments. So that's also something that came out of that conference as a very important takeaway. Another thing is that when you regard to supply chains, that energy supply, security of energy, and access to energy is linked. It's one. Another thing came up when we talked about fuels, or petroleum, but you know, fuels is the biggest chunk out of the supply chain. We looked to this as a commodity. Fuel, say, you know, everybody knows fuel. We go to the gas station, get a fuel. When we look at the energy, at the new energy mix, it's not a commodity. It's not perceived as a commodity anymore, but as a capability enabler. So it's more important as a whole, as a package, to become more effective, to make your enablement work. So that's the thing. And then for on the operations chain, well, I mentioned that briefly. So the energy shift must guarantee the effectiveness, but there might be new opportunities. There might be new opportunities when new technologies come in for the operational guy to have more efficient energy use, and maybe to shorten our logistic footprint when it comes to energy, especially the energy that requires quite a lot of resources. So, briefly said, it will impact the supply chains for NATO operations. So that will be the strands of work that we are now, as I speak, developing to adapt the scope of our work for the future. Our structure will need new competences. The positioning of our new Petroleum Committee, which will have another name, I don't know yet, maybe Energy Committee. The position within the whole of the NATO command structure and the other committees will have to rethink that, because we need to have the connection to those who have the portfolio on energy security, which is Julian's group, the political committee. We need to have the portfolio, those who are looking on the enablement of SACEUR's AOR. That's the committee that belongs to my division, the Policy and Planning Division. This is, you know, those who give the political military advice to our leadership to make the right decision at the military and the political level. So that's two. I talked about a capability enabler. If we talk about capability enabling, we got a group at NATO, which is the Conference of National Armament Directors. That's the thing. That's the people that are responsible for capability development, the hardware, if I can say so. So we need to liaise with them too, with all the stakeholders. And then the ability to reach out to where it happens, to international organizations such as EU, International Agency, and so forth. Reach out to industry, for obvious reasons, and then I would say especially the petroleum industry and how it's going to look in the future, and the academics, because sometimes we will have to do studying. As I said, we need to prepare for war, not peacetime. So the solutions that are valid in peacetime are not necessarily valid for wartime or for the purpose. So turn back to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Philippe. I'll come back to you in a second with the fuel supply chain issue, and which I think is a crucial element for the deterrence and defense on the eastern flank. But I think one of the key elements that I would like to underline is NATO per se, and I think you've portrayed it very well. We have started to look through energy lens on different elements in our house: capabilities, intelligence, operations, innovation, resilience, infrastructure, undersea infrastructure, I mean, probably space infrastructure is coming next. But my point is, I think there's also an internal shift in NATO where, not being an energy organization, we start to do things bearing in mind the implications that energy has for our collective defense. And I think there are two additional elements I'd like to highlight. One of them is, we, by design, we will not be the greenest organization on Earth. And but you know, this is a very delicate issue, and I think Julian also mentioned it. At the same time, Philippe gave another approach to it. I think we need to be, politicians want to have progress on energy transition. At the same time, we have capabilities, as Philippe said, which are going to be with us for the next 40 years. And those capabilities are capabilities which are still operational on jet fuel. So you know, there's also a political challenge here, and I think let's see how things are going to develop towards the Washington summit. But I think those are the key elements to remember. When I'm talking about Washington summit, I would like to go to you and Anna right now a little bit, and because of course NATO is an alliance of 31, soon 32, but there's one ally that is a clear leader in a lot of spheres, and of course that ally has a very particular right now approach to energy, energy transition, energy security. If you look at the next maybe 2 or 3 years in the United States, what would be the main trends that we as NATO should pay attention to? What might be the decisions that we should be paying attention to? They will be, of course, that's at least my personal opinion, have a major impact on how we are going to do things in NATO.
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot of impact that comes. But what I wanted to mention before that, and kind of that ties in with what Philippe was talking about, is that we have already seen an energy transition based on military needs. And that was when the UK and English army has turned from coal to oil. And that happened after Germany was using oil, right? And England has traded the energy security of own resources, of owning coal, to potentially less secure but more capable oil. And I think looking at the energy transition that's going to come, NATO has the potential of playing a very important role here. Because as it liaises with others, it actually probably might be the one organization that could pick a winner. And because it's not constrained by costs, it might have a lot of actually ability to push forward some technologies above others. And going back to actually now to the US, there's a lot of thinking on the military, and then Luke could probably add much more here than I do because he's been involved in many of those circles. But you know, one thing is looking at actually nuclear capabilities as a micronuclear on the battlefield, and that's something that that U.S. is already looking at that could potentially later spill over to more commercial operations. So. But in the U.S., all of the above approach probably is going to pertain based on what U.S. as it has within the country. So the oil, gas, but also increasingly renewables, hydrogen, potentially, as I said, nuclear. The more focus on nuclear is visible, and it was not there before.
Thanks, Anna. And I know you need to leave a little bit earlier, so I'll move to you right now. Because I think we've touched upon that element. And you've said that NATO soon will be training a group of Ukrainians in energy security, but I also understand that having those Ukrainians there is also a good occasion for us to listen to their lessons, identify which we transform, hopefully then into lessons learned for NATO and the alliance. Is there anything that you would like to point out to at this stage when it comes to the war and the Ukrainian reply to it, or the Russian strategy and tactics on the ground when it comes to energy that, I think we should generally pay attention to? What are the first initial elements in that broader discussion that might be important for NATO to be prepared to the conflict that hopefully never comes, but when it comes, how to better mitigate that threat?
Well, I think that some of them are obvious. What we saw is the Russians tried to push Ukraine into the dark, into the cold over the winter because they failed to achieve their strategic objectives on the battlefield. So they went all in, and they adopted a whole-country approach to try to win that war by going after that infrastructure, essentially triggering a wave of refugees along Europe, another wave, and installing war fatigue inside allied capitals. That failed, luckily, and Western assistance played a huge role in that aspect when it came to air defense systems, first and foremost, but also when it came to spare parts, auto transformers, things of that sort. So there's plenty for us to learn in terms of our resilience, in terms how also one of the contributing factors in Ukraine that allowed them to survive is Ukrenergo, so the grid operator, employs directly technicians, and actually has a big, I think 4,000 technicians for Ukrenergo, and they've been conducting repairs as the strike went through. In Europe, in Western Europe, we have a tendency to outsource everything to other companies. I mean, utilities, grid operators, they don't have the same capabilities. Also, what we saw is that the Ukrainians were very good and are very good in liaising directly between the grid operators and the military. So whenever there is an attack incoming, those two parts of the state, the government, took to each other directly, which facilitated back in time very rapid responses from Ukraine. But we can also learn from Ukrainians about how to use green tech on the battlefield. Actually, Ukraine is currently, I think, one of the first countries on the globe who has experience in using green technologies in a war, and green technologies that are effective. For instance, microgrids. They're deploying microgrids on the front lines, so local grids that are not connected to the main grid, that are powered by, for instance, solar panels, to power up their mobile devices, to launch their drones, so that provides them more autonomy. Another example is if you talk to the special operation forces, they will tell you that they use, for instance, electric vehicles, because they have no heat signature, they're silent, so they move close to Russian positions overnight unseen, they do their job, and they go back to their positions. So I think that there is both of those elements. Let me just rebound on a couple of things. Anna said that NATO can pick the winner when it comes to next technologies. One of the objectives of this energy transition by design initiative that I talked about is to send a strong demand signal to the industry, because so many industry players are very confused. They simply do not know where the military wants to go when it comes to military equipment, so that indeed is one of the objectives here. And obviously, you touched upon it as well, Dominik, in your opening statement, it's about avoiding new dependencies. And we know how strong and big China is when it comes to the control of green tech currently. And we need to make sure that our military will not be dependent on shortages when it comes to supply chains in that respect.
So just to quickly follow up on the technological element, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but also the new NATO innovation fund, and then of course accelerator called Diana, Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic. One of the pillars and fields of interest for the next years is energy resilience, yes? And then I understand this is also a chance to bridge the gap between NATO, startups, emerging tech, but also bigger companies. Is that the idea behind it? Well, as I know you're not covering that directly.
Absolutely it is, and Diana received 1,300 applications for that challenge that fall, which is huge. So we will be reviewing those in a couple of days. But indeed, you have Diana, you have the Innovation Fund, you also have the Science for Peace and Technology Program, SPS, through which NATO funds young scientists in developing technologies also related to energy security, future technologies, such as, for instance, there are interlinkages between energy security and cyber, energy security and AI, energy security and quantum. So there is plenty of room to work on those technologies through NATO, but going back and kind of zooming out again, really one of the underpinning kind of reasons why the Secretary General decided to launch the Energy Transition by Design initiative is to send a very strong demand signal to the industry and to preserve the interoperability of our forces in the future, actually.
Thanks for that, Julian. Before I go to Philippe, you've touched upon SPS, Science for Peace and Security. Let me do also a little bit of a promotion here. As we are at the university with a lot of scientists, Science for Peace and Security is one of the key elements of NATO's cooperation with the academic world. Energy security is one of the 7 areas of interest. So do look up that potential way of engaging also your institutions, research institutes, and look for partners. I think there's a growing interest on the Polish side, also thanks to the amazing job done by Julian. So do not hesitate. I think we currently need more and more of Polish approach to energy security, especially bearing in mind also our vicinity to Ukraine and the ability to work very closely with our Ukrainian partners. And of commercial. Philippe, I've promised you will talk about my favorite topic, the fuel supply chain, which is a critical part of what NATO does in terms of making sure that allies are prepared and NATO is ready to fight when necessary. Could you walk us through where we are and what are the potential next steps, maybe explaining a little bit what the NATO pipeline system is, just not everyone here in the room might know it. Over to you.
Thank you, Dominik. Yes, I will try to be clear and brief, but in 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, ICE was an eye-opener in NATO, the first one. So all that sudden, Article 5 became inside again. So while 20 years, for more than 20 years, the focus was on deployable capability, expeditionary operations, all that sudden Article 5 thing came closer. So the Petroleum Committee at that time developed a new concept for fuel supply chain. Based on 4 pillars. The first pillar is what we call host nation support. So this is actually what can we expect, we NATO allies, expect as support, in this case fuel support, from a host nation, from a nation when transiting that nation or actually deploying in that nation. So it's an important thing. It's the first pillar and the strongest pillar, or should be the strongest pillar for fuel supply to NATO forces. It all has to do with resilient energy infrastructure, resilient fuel infrastructure, hence all the efforts that has been done by NATO so far over the last years with regard to resilience in general terms, not only energy but also in other domains. That's one. The second one is contractual support, so that's how can we rely on contracting out. So NATO has some experience with contracting out logistics support in general and fuel supply in particular. The thing is there, we need to have the right balance between military capabilities and contractual solutions. So that needs to be addressed in a very prudent way, but it's part of the solution. A third pillar is the NATO pipeline system. NATO has 9 individual pipeline systems and has on top of that a number of isolated petroleum infrastructure. Most of them are in big NATO ports, like Suda Bay, for example, in Crete, to name one. These 9 systems, pipeline systems, are stretching out from Iceland over Norway, Denmark, Germany, and then the one which is of the biggest importance for Poland is the Central Europe pipeline system, which is in the center of Europe, links all the major production and storage facilities in Rotterdam, Antwerp, and in France and in Germany to that system, most of them. So it stretches out from the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and Germany. Just to give you an idea, the CEPS is not only a military for a NATO asset, but it's also used for civilian purposes, the spare capacity. You remember that I say we're preparing for war. So the capacity of the system has been designed for war, not for peacetime. So we have a spare capacity which we use for a fuel supply to civilian airports. I'm not going to go deeper in that, but just to give you how much fuel it's transported to the CEPS for civilian purpose, it accounts for 1/3 of all jet fuel supplies in the 5 nations that are part of the CEPS. We are quite a big jet fuel distributor. And then finally, we have deployable capabilities. So nations have deployable fuel capabilities, which are capable to receive, store, distribute fuel. It's a modular concept, which can be tailored missions, so we can make it bigger, smaller. We can add components to it because it's a fully mobile and modular concept. So a mix of all that should ensure a NATO fuel supply chain. But the concept is okay, but now we're coming to the NATO fuel supply chain. Most of you here are from Poland, so your nation were the precursor for a number of assessments on the NATO fuel supply chain as a whole, in a 360 degrees approach, not only to NATO's east flank, but also to the rest of it. We conducted studies, assessments for 4 years. The last ones are the most accurate and most refined, because now, in the early 4 years ago, we didn't understood the requirement fully, what we would need for fuel. When we didn't neither understand the exact location where we have to bring that fuel to. Now with the new set of plans, we do. So we moved forward on that. So we now know the requirement better, where. All these assessments, and I think we did in total 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all came to the same conclusions. There's a shortfall at NATO's east flank. So we need to do something about it. So we did that. And we went through a number of NATO processes to actually bring forward all these projects and so forth. So what we are doing now, we have looked at short-term solutions, medium-term solutions, and long-term solutions. So short-term solutions are like reactivating, for example, bits and pieces of our fuel infrastructure, which were deactivated over the years because we didn't need them. That's an example. Medium term is actually making small adjustments on existing capabilities to become more performant. And then at the Madrid summit last year, heads of state of government has taken the decision on the long-term solution. And the long-term solution is actually looking at building new petroleum infrastructure where needed. Definitely at NATO's east flank. But also the existing systems we have been and will be reassessed, and those will have to be reviewed, and also the capacities of these systems will have to be reviewed. The reality is that in times of conflict, most likely we will have to move assets, fuel, from west to east. So you can have all your production capacities, that's all fine, but at the end of the day, you have to bring the fuel to the warfighter in one way or another. And the thing is, in time of crisis and especially in war, of course, we need to have access to large quantities of fuel at short notice. Let's put it that way, at no notice. So that's why we have these capability in place. They are there. So I can tell you every single operation that NATO has conducted, the SEPS was used in that thing at nearly no lead time. So they had the capacities. This was the case in the Iraqi wars. This was the case in the war in the Balkans. This was the case in Libya. And this was the case all over the ISAF operations where the US extensively used the capacity of the SEPS in Ramstein, actually, where they did where their goods, most of the goods were brought to. So that's where we are today. So as I speak now, the strategic commands has been, because this is a strategic commands issue, because they are the requirement setting in our NATO standardized process to build these capabilities. They have to do the work in consultation with nations. So they know what they need. The nations, they go in dialogue with the nations so they can discuss the projects that are needed to bring that capacity there. So basically, depending on the effort that nations are capable of providing the resources, and also for NATO, we're talking about a horizon of, in the best case, 10 years to 20 years, which is long, but it's short. You don't build a fuel depot through the whole process in one day and all the capacities. So the thing is also that, as I've been informed, that we will look at the priorities first. Where are the priorities? And the priorities are very well known. We're going to start there. So we have to go for small nucleus. Okay, this is low-hanging fruit. Let's start here and then spread out. So that's how we're going to build that long-term capability. So I think so. That plan should be delivered by the end of next year at NATO HQ for decision by ours.
Yeah, thanks, Philippe, for this presentation, detailed explanation of how we are going to basically build that pipeline. It's not easy to say. I mean, we can say it in that particular setting because I think here you understand very well the necessity of energy security. But of course, the discussion about building a pipeline in the midst of energy transition, green transition, is not the easiest decision. So what I was signaling from the beginning, NATO is in a very specific place where, bearing in mind the political priorities, we also need to make sure that we are ready to fight from day one, as you said, basically with potentially no notice element, which is there. Before I wrap it up, I just want to make sure that that I give an opportunity to our colleagues here in this room to ask questions or give comments. Sir, you want to have a question? Do we have a mic, or shall I give my own mic? I will give my own mic.
Lou Pularisi with Energy Policy Research Foundation. So this is a very interesting conversation because the existing policies of the West and Europe is to impose a more costly, presumably more environmentally friendly energy system on the Western economies. So national wealth is going to decline, and elements of national power will decline. Now, at the same time, but when you think about the damage function from environment versus war, that might be actually the real existential threat. So how do you discipline our political overlords to make sure that we deploy forces that are operationally effective, and which may not be politically correct in terms of the fuel mix? I mean, I sort of like the examples you gave because they were operationally. If I were a commander, I'd say, okay, that's pretty good stuff, let's use it. But a lot of the stuff people want you to use is not so hot, probably very ineffective. And so how do you discipline the process to say, okay, look, The real existential threat is not climate, it's war. So we need to have the best capacity and capability to demonstrate that we can prevent war. And I don't think that's tanks with batteries.
Thanks. That's indeed an excellent question, which I think Julian is basically dealing with on a daily basis. I'll give you the floor, Julian, and as I think you need to go in 3 minutes to catch the plane. So if you could answer that question. Over to you.
Yes, thank you for that question. So no one is imposing anything on anybody. This process that I described to you will be driven by allies, collectively. So the political masters will have full control. Now, okay, we
That
might
may not be a good thing, but I understand.
We might not see a, I don't know, electric tank tomorrow, but what we see is, for instance, submarines powered by hydrogen. They're more silent, they can dive longer. So that's another example of the things that are happening. Now, when it comes to the costs, this year, 2023, the industry, globally, not in Western Europe, not in the US, is investing more in sustainable power supplies than in fossil fuels. It's a journey, it's a tipping point.
You're describing an input, not an output. You're describing an input. So we have huge subsidies. We have all the. I don't disagree with your facts, but it's an input. It's not an output. It's not a measure of wealth. It's not a measure of economic growth. It's just a measure of how much money we're putting into things. They might pay off, but you have to consider that there might be massive failure modes in this stuff. We're already seeing it in the U.S. We're already seeing lots of failure modes in these technologies. So I don't think that's not a metric that's helpful if you think about national power. National power comes from wealth, population.
We don't do economic policy at NATO.
I understand.
We do defense policy, and what I can tell you for sure from the examples that I given you is that you can be both. You can have good, strong equipment that is green at the same time, but it's primarily strong. Again, if you have a submarine, okay, that is not powered by a diesel engine or an electric engine, but by a hydrogen, it's more effective, full stop. And you cannot deny it. You might not like it. You might challenge it, but you cannot deny it. That's where it is. And I think that those examples will keep on mushrooming in the future. And the real goal here is to make sure that, again, not in 5 years, not in 10, but in 20, that our equipment will be able to talk to each other. Because if it doesn't, then we will have a big problem if we end up in a crisis mode situation.
I think Julian needs to run to catch the plane. Philippe, would you like to add anything to that particular element, which I think is a very critical, foundational element for NATO, which is not easy to answer right now. Thanks once again, but in the end, we need to make sure that there is enough deterrence and defense for NATO. Philippe, but
yeah, of course, the more money you have, the more capabilities you can buy and develop. But that's for sure. For me, it's a no-brainer. But what I see is that we at NATO, when we go through the transition, and I mentioned that, we should not jeopardize the operational effectiveness. That's a given. So when we go through that, we give ourselves the task to put together guidance concepts and even up to doctrine to ensure that. And that's one thing. That's one angle. When we talked about capability development, yes, there will have to be choices made in the capability development. I think NATO has a long tradition of multinational development things, or at least acquisition and all that kind of stuff. It's easy to become it serves also the interoperability. But well, in that perspective, I would say, I'll give you an example. The Petroleum Committee has developed a vision on future fuels. Okay, so the first time you did that exercise was in 2007. So we're now in the process to produce a new one. Actually, hopefully we get it by the end of the year, ready and approved by allies. We used to have in the past an approach for future fuels for all three domains: air, land, and sea. Now, we don't have it anymore. So, what in the initial phase was the most complex one was aviation. Now for me, it's the most straightforward. It's going to be sustainable aviation fuel. There might be, we heard about initiatives on hydrogen for aviation, but for the time being, the F-35, I don't see it flying on hydrogen, and not now and not in the future. So, land is a mix. Land, we're going to have a mix. Electric vehicles, yes. You're not going to put this in a tank. You're not going to put 10 tons of batteries extra in a tank that's already 50 tons. So that's a non-issue. But in certain applications, it might be a light fighting vehicle and so forth. I'm not saying about batteries, because that's another thing. We are looking at hydrogen, and other electrification doesn't mean necessarily batteries. So that's one thing, because personally, I don't believe in batteries. It's not a sustainable solution. Not for you today in your car, not for, and certainly not for military equipment. So that's it. And there's a whole issue on supply chain with that too. So land is about, more or less, we know where it goes. Maritime, that's a nightmare. Maritime is a nightmare. It's LNG, CNG, ammonia, electricity, hydrogen, diesel, nuclear. Where are we going to go? As a military, I had a question from the NATO Industrial Advisory Group, and they were discussing maritime. And I had to give a presentation, and he said, what are you going to do about interoperability? What about the supply chain? I say, frankly, I don't know. It's going to be you, allies, who have to make the decision. You know, ammonia is toxic. Hydrogen is too dangerous. So nuclear is already there. But then nuclear, we don't consider in our energy mix and nuclear. There's a simple reason for that. It's political. There are a number of nations said when you say nuclear, they go ballistic. They don't accept that. Okay? Even though we're going to go back to nuclear. And there are many initiatives ongoing for small nuclear reactors and all that kind of stuff in certain things. That's one reason. The political issue, and also there's no really an interoperability issue, because nuclear is only used by very few nations in very specific applications. So there's no interoperability issue for NATO one. So yeah, we will have to make choices in capability development. Resourcing them is going to be one of them, but this is always the case. So, but if the energy transition is going to make us all poorer, well, let's see where that goes then.
Yeah. Bearing in mind where we are, and we are in Rzeszów, very close to actually where the war is happening. Let me also reassure everyone here in this room that when the situation requires a decision by NATO to basically apply collective defense clause, we will not be thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. This is not a requirement for us to take a, no, you're laughing, but I mean, my point is, I think we also need to be very clear. It cannot have an impact on our operational capabilities. If we are supposed to defend every inch of this territory, we will need to do it with capabilities that we have without any limitations on what and how basically is being committed by them at this stage. Full stop. And I think the Supreme Allied Commander in shape is really don't give a about that at this stage. Well, yeah. One more question? We have more questions. Okay, we have 7 minutes, so we need to wrap it up. First question here, and then here.
Yeah, okay, so I tried to talk briefly. Alexandra Wojtowicz from NASK. So basically, I was wondering about, because you talk quite a lot about military capabilities, also, of course, in the context of energy security. And my question is basically, what do you do to ensure that these capabilities, especially in regards to energy security, will not be influenced by information operations, like disinformation, etc. As we can see that the discourse about energy, and in war in Ukraine, like leaving for a moment, energy topic too, are very highly influenced by that. So do you have some decision-making process or tactics to deal with that?
Let me collect the second one and then we go back to that.
Sir?
I asked this question by Analyst, if you don't mind.
I'll translate.
Да.
Okay.
Я тут єдиний представник України, я керівник Офісу ідентифікації загроз Укренерго. І хотів задати питання. Ми в Україні добре знаємо, що безпека – це досить дорого. А в той же час для операторів критичної інфраструктури важливим є мінімізація затрат при їх виробничій діяльності. Яким чином поєднати ці два поняття? Тобто, як домогтися від операторів, чи можливо це уряд має робити, інвестувати і забезпечувати безпеку?
I'm the only representative of Ukraine here, and I'm the advisor on security, energy security to the government. And we realize that security is very expensive. How do you mean to...
Це оператори критичної інфраструктури мають інвестувати в безпеку, чи це урядові?
Due to the fact that its security is very expensive, who should invest into this security, either the operators or the governments? As the Ukrainian energy system, we are curious about it.
I have an answer, but
after 7 minutes. Right?
Yeah, I will leave my comments to the end. Anna, Philippe, would you like to tackle any of the two questions that you've heard?
I probably can just refer to the Ukrainian question because I cannot answer the first one, but referring to we actually have been looking at that issue. And one thing that came across is that many of the hardware that's needed, like generators, doesn't sit there in the storage waiting for to be deployed. They are actually made to order, and commercially that makes sense. Strategically, particularly if you are expecting a conflict, not so much. So maybe there are ways in which to provide strategic reserves of, particularly if you're thinking about electrifying everything, about those specific equipment that Russia has been actually targeting specifically and increasingly. Because what happens, we've seen Russia targeting first small connections and then started actually targeting generators and on and on. Interestingly, it's not targeting the huge pipelines that still are selling gas to Europe. So it's specifically targeting Ukraine. And the issue is how to, other microgrids that can be developed or other sources of energy that can actually generate energy where needed. And I think that's where micronuclear comes in to a very good extent. So I think there is a lot of thinking about it. Unfortunately, nothing seems to be short term. Everything is being thought as a longer term solution. So for now, what we end up will have to do is basically solidarity and ability to provide the equipment that was ordered for another country, but the country can spare that or can actually use equipment that can be still used for Ukraine, but also how to secure that equipment, and there are lessons to be drawn. And in fact, we actually, with my colleague, we are looking at the attacks that have been pursued on Ukraine, specifically energy infrastructure, trying to develop a description of strategy that Russia has employed and how one can actually avoid becoming affected by it.
Philippe, any final comments from your side? We need to wrap up.
Cyber is of a big concern to us all. For me, it's a priority that the Petroleum Committee is working on. Over the past years, we have done extensive auditing of most of our most advanced systems. We came up with a number of findings. We did a tabletop exercise and we defined a way ahead how to best handle that. So what we're going to do, to answer shortly, it's the operator who is responsible, or the host nation that is responsible for cybersecurity. We're not going to do a course in cyber. I'm not a cyber expert, but there are two facets on it. It's IT and OT. I think in the IT thing, we are pretty much good. it's in the OT that we are the weak point. So we got like a headquarters full of IT specialists, but no zero OT. So that's one. So what we're going to do now is that we issued already a guidance to nations on how to protect their NATO infrastructure on their territory against cyber, to make them understand of the danger and how and what to look at. It's one thing. And the second thing is that now we are looking at our standards, criteria and standards for building petroleum installation or fuel installations to better foresee cybersecurity issue in there. Like, what are the standards for protecting your system against cyber attacks and so forth and so forth. So that's what we are busy. That's what we're going to discuss next week in Lisbon with the experts around the table.
Excellent. Many thanks to all three panelists, two of them still being present. And there is a tradition here at this conference that the best speaker receives a prize from the jury who's sitting in the audience, and basically, Philippe, you're going to get a surprise, because you're selected as the best speaker, the best panelist on this panel. Congratulations to you. I understand you will receive an excellent...
Thank you very much. Thank you for your appreciation.
So now this comes with a requirement that you're coming to this conference every single year for the next 10 years. And no, jokes aside, once again, many thanks. Thank you to the audience. Thanks for excellent questions. And have a great rest of the conference. Thank you very much.